Chapter 4. The Heat Ray. I was totally numb and stood knee deep in the heather, staring at the mound that hid the Martians. These creatures were like a leash of thin black webs, like the arms of an octopus, and rose up like a thin rod, joint by joint, having at its upper end a circular disc that moved with a wobbling motion. I heard one man exclaim, "What ugly brutes! God, good! What ugly brutes!" The sunset faded to twilight before anything further happened. Then I saw some cabmen and others walk boldly towards the sandpits. I also saw a little black knot of men, the foremost of whom was waving a white flag. This was the deputation. There had been a hasty constitution. It had been resolved to show to the Martians that we realized their intelligence and wanted to communicate with them. I learned later that Ogilvy, Stent, and Henderson's were with this delegation too. Suddenly there was a flash of light and a quantity of luminous greenish smoke came out of the pit in three distinct puffs, which drove up, one after another, in the still air. This smoke was so heavy that the blue sky overhead seemed to darken abruptly. At the same time, a faint hissing sound became audible. Beyond the pit, people with the white flags stood transfixed by these flashes. Slowly, the hissing passed into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Then, slowly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a light seemed to flicker from it. Soon, flashes of actual flame leaped from one man to another. It was as if each man was suddenly turned to fire. I saw them staggering and falling, and their supporters turning to run. I stood staring, not as yet realizing that this was death leaping from man to man in that distant crowd. It was sweeping around, swiftly and steadily. This flaming death, this invisible, inevitable sword of heat. I saw it coming towards me by the flashes, bushes it touched, and was too astounded to stir. Then it was as if an invisible but intensely heated finger was drawn through the heather between me and the Martians. Something fell with a crash far away, so the left where the road from walking station opens out on the common. Immediately the humming and hissing stopped, and the black dome like object sank slowly out of sight into the pit. All that happened with such swiftness that I stood motionless, dumbfounded and dazzled by the flashes of light. The common was now dark almost to blackness. Nothing changed except that the little group of black specks with the flag of white had been swept out of existence. Fear gripped me, and I ran weeping silently as a child might do. I did not dare to look back. I remember nothing of my flight except the stress of blundering against the trees and stumbling through the heather. At last I could go no further. I was exhausted, and I fell by the wayside. I must have remained there for some time. I sat up, surprised. My terror had fallen from me like a garment. My hat was gone, and my collar had become loose. But I found myself the self of every day again, a decent, ordinary citizen. What I had been through earlier seemed like a dream. I rose and walked up the steep incline, my mind a blank wonder. Everything around me was as usual. I stopped a group of people. "What news from the common?" said I. "People seem fairly silly about the common," said one of the women. "What's this all about? Haven't you heard of the one from Mars?" And the entire group laughed. I startled my wife with my haggard appearance. I told her my story. She did not find my experience incredible. Her face was deadly white. "They may come here," she said again and again. "They can scarcely move." I began to comfort her and myself by repeating all that Ogilvy had told me about the Martians establishing themselves on Earth. In particular, I laid stress on the gravitational difficulty. On the surface of the Earth, the force of gravity is 3 times what it is on the surface of Mars. A Martian would weigh 3 times more than on Mars. With wine and food and the necessity of reassuring my wife, I gradually grew courageous and secure. "A shell in the pit," said I. "If worst comes to the worst, we'll kill them all." I did not know it, but that was the last civilized dinner I was to eat for very many strange and terrible days. Chapter 5. The Fighting Begins. Such a day lives in my memory as a day of suspense. I had slept but little. I rose early and went into my garden and stood listening. But towards the common there was nothing moving. The milkman came as usual. He told me that during the night the Martians had been surrounded by troops and that guns were expected. "They aren't to be killed," said the milkman, "if that can possibly be avoided." My neighbor walked up to me and said, "They say that there is another of those blessed things fallen among the pine woods." About Bifreed Goldings. This is number 2. This was true. All night the Martians were hammering and stirring upon the machines they were making ready. And a few seconds after midnight on Friday, the crowd in Church Road walking had seen a star fall from heaven into the pine woods. This was the second cylinder. After breakfast, instead of working, I decided to walk towards the common. Under the railway bridge, I found a group of soldiers, sappers. I think they told me no one was allowed over the canal. I told them of my sight of the Martians the previous evening. They became excited and plied me with questions. I described the heat ray to them, and they began to argue among themselves. Each had his own suggestion about how to fight them. After a while, I left them and went to the railway station to get as many morning newspapers as I could. The morning newspapers contained only a very inaccurate description of the killing of Stent, Henderson, Ogilvy, and the others. The Martians did not show an inch of themselves. About 3 o'clock there began the thud of a gun at measured intervals from Jersey. I learned that the second cylinder was being shelled in the hope of destroying that object before it opened. It was only about 5, however, that a field gun reached Chobham for use against the first body of Martians. About 6 in the evening, I sat for tea with my wife. I heard a muffled detonation from the common and a gust of firing immediately afterwards. Close on the heel of that came a violent, rattling crash quite close to us that shook the ground. I saw the treetops above the Oriental College burst into smoking red flame and the tower of the little church beside it slide down into ruin. The pinnacle of the mosque had vanished. One of our chimneys cracked as if a shot had hit it. A piece of it came clattering down the files and made a heap of broken red fragments upon the flowered by my study window. I gripped my wife's arm and without any ceremony ran her out into the road. "We can't possibly stay here," I said to her. "But where are we to go?" said my wife in terror. I remembered her cousins at Leatherhead. "Leatherhead?" I shouted above the sudden noise. "But how?" I told my wife to stay there and rent the owner of the spotted dog. I borrowed his horse and cart for £2 and promised to bring them back by midnight. I did not want to explain anything. I rushed home and packed a few things, then put my wife in the cart and the servant and her box at the back and started driving my cart towards Old Walking, down the opposite slope of Maybury Hills. At the bottom of the hill, I turned my head to look at the hillside I was leaving. Thick streamers of smoke shot with threads of riot fire were driving up into the still air. The road was dotted with people running towards us, very distinct through the quiet hot air. One heard the whir of a machine gun and cracking of rifles. Apparently, the Martians were setting fire to everything within the range of their heat ray.